Chapter 1. Desiree Black's sword was planted hilt-deep in a cypress tree. She stared at the weapon, a wooden practice sword, not even a real steel one, in consternation. She was supposed to have landed this blow on her sparring partner, not on some random tree. But instead, she'd hesitated a little too long when the moment had come to thrust toward her partner. And then she'd overcompensated and lunged further forward than she'd meant to. And this poor cypress had paid the price. She sighed, wrapped her hands around the hilt, and pulled. Anyone else wouldn't have been able to dislodge the weapon, but in her hands, the sword came loose after only a moment of straining. Splinters rained down onto her boots. "Get back in the match, Des. Unless you only fight trees." The light-hearted taunt had come from directly in front of her. Des glanced up at her sparring partner, her older foster brother, Con Roser. He was smirking, the way he always smirked when he challenged her. His green eyes laughing, his sandy golden hair somehow managing to look irritatingly perfect, even though they'd been sparring for nearly half an hour now. There was a note of concern in his voice that she knew no one else noticed, though. It reminded her that she needed to do better, that she needed to get back in this fight, that she needed to land some decent blows to something other than a cypress, and fast, before the rebellion captain who was watching from the sidelines decided she wasn't worth recruiting. Biting her lip, she lifted her training sword again, but took a few extra seconds to sink into defense position, using the time to sneak a glance at the recruiter, who stood a few yards away at the edge of the small clearing. He was smoothing out his long mustache, his gaze inscrutable, as he raised an eyebrow at the splintered cypress. "I suppose the bayou must grow weaker trees than we have up north," he mused, and then he waved a hand at Des and Con. "Let's have one last match between the two of you, and then I believe I'll have seen all I need to make my decision." Des swallowed and glanced at Con. He nodded at her, eyes full of confidence, for both himself and for her. She envied his certainty, his easy conviction. She tried hard to swallow her own worry as she squared off against him again and breathed deeply and focused on the swamp around her to try to settle her nerves. The wisps of mist drifting along the boggy ground, the earthy smell of mushrooms, the far-off splashes of hunting alligators. The trees around her were solid and hardy, their sturdy branches overshadowing the little clearing, and she imagined herself drawing on their strength. After a moment, she felt a bit steadier. A flash of movement a few feet away pulled her from her thoughts. Con was lifting his sword. Quick as anything, she took in his stance, the way he shifted his weight, the direction of his gaze. He was going to feint left. If she stepped in while he was feinting, if she angled her sword just right, she could nail him hard in the sternum. The blow, and the resulting quick end to the match, should be enough to impress the recruiter. But she'd have to judge the amount of power to put behind the strike just right, or she'd risk seriously injuring Con. Sickness swirled in her stomach at the thought, overtaking her newfound sense of calm. Her hands still throbbed from driving her sword into the tree. What if she accidentally put that much power behind a blow that actually hit her brother? Con darted forward, fast as a swamp snake. He feinted left, just as she'd known he would. Now was her chance. Now. She'd hesitated too long, though, and Con smacked her painfully on the shoulder with the flat of his sword. 1 point to him. 2 more, and he'd win this match. And she'd be that much closer to missing her chance to join the rebellion. And missing her chance to honor her parents' legacy. She rubbed her spine and turned to face Khan again, trying to keep her face blank, even as she fumed internally. Curse it, she'd had that point. It would have been hers, if she could have just brought herself to land that blow. She knew she was strong enough to have done it. But that was just the problem. She was the strongest girl, the strongest teenager, in the whole village of Bleakwater. If she'd accidentally used too much power, she could have snapped one of his ribs. She could already hear the sick crunch that such an action would make. Could see the way Khan would bow over in pain, gasping for breath. She could all too easily envision the way his whole future in the rebellion would be ruined. All because Des couldn't rein in her strength. "Mind if I join?" called another voice, pulling Des out of her miserable thoughts. It was Peter, her younger foster brother, though he wasn't that much younger, being 16 to Des's 17. He smiled at Des. It wasn't a smirk, like the expression that Khan so often tossed her way, but a true smile, sweet and open, and a little worried. Peter's black hair, cut in shoulder-length waves to mirror his older brother's, was carefully tied back so it stayed out of his eyes, and his pale skin shone with sweat, even though his earlier sparring match with one of the recruiter's underlings had only lasted half the length of Khan's and Des's. The 3 siblings were the only ones trying out for rebellion positions this year. Although several other Bleakwater teenagers were angling to join, most of them wanted to wait and train for another year or 2 first. "You want to be on Des's team? Even out the odds?" Khan asked, twirling his practice sword in a complicated pattern that somehow managed to look lazy when he was the one doing it. Peter raised an eyebrow. "Stop treating your sword like a juggler's baton," he answered calmly. "And no, I want to be on your side." Des narrowed her eyes. "Wait, that doesn't seem fair." Peter smiled innocently, kicking a few mushrooms out from underfoot as he sank into a ready stance. "It doesn't, does it? But Khan and I will do our best anyway." She ground her teeth. So that was his plan. He meant to force her to show her full strength, to back her into a corner so that she had no choice but to fight from instinct, rather than hesitate and think and carefully judge her blows. The recruiter watched their exchange, still thoughtfully smoothing out his mustache. A free-for-all, he decided. He took a few steps back to give them extra room, leaning against a tree at the far edge of the clearing, and raised his voice a bit more so that they could hear him. "Every person for themselves. Khan already has 1 point. First person to 3 points wins, and gets my automatic recommendation to join the rebellion without the need to prove themselves further." Everything within Des shriveled up into what felt like a solid ball of worry in the pit of her stomach. She needed to join the rebellion. It was her destiny. It was the only way she could honor the memory of her parents, who'd been high-ranking rebellion heroes even before they'd sacrificed themselves for the cause. And she wanted this for herself, too. The chance to fight for good, and to help stop the corrupt empire of the Spirit King, which was slowly creeping its way across the entire world. But she couldn't hurt her brothers either. She lifted her sword back to defense position. She could do this. She had to do this. Winning this match would be the easiest, quickest way to win over the recruiter. All she had to do was fight. Con and Peter lunged at her as one. The move was practiced, familiar. The three of them had fought together many times, especially since none of the older teens in Bleakwater would deign to give Des the time of day, much less spar with her. She lifted her sword. Peter's thrust was easy to block, and she parried quickly, tapping him gingerly on the hip with the flat of her sword. He shook his head at her, rolling his eyes with a look that said, "You can do better than that, and you know it." "1 point," the recruiter said, but when she glanced at him, he was frowning. Oops. While her attention had been diverted, Con had slipped beneath her guard and landed a blow to her leg. Hissing with annoyance, she pivoted and just managed to catch him with her own wooden blade to his left arm. He yelped, rubbing the spot. She froze at the sound, afraid she'd hurt him. And in that moment, he dodged back toward her, knocked her sword away easily to jab her quickly in the ribs, and then pivoted neatly and thrust his sword into Peter's stomach, winning 2 more points and the match, and automatic entry into the rebellion. She dropped her sword to her side and shook her head, disbelieving. She'd been nervous about this match, but she hadn't allowed herself to think about what would happen if she actually failed. And now that she'd lost, now that she'd frozen up in front of the recruiter yet again, it would be that much harder to prove she was ready to join up. She had no idea what she would do if the rebellion didn't accept her. She only knew what she wouldn't do. Allow herself to be conscripted into the ranks of the Spirit King's forces. But according to rumors, the Spirit King was sending recruiters this way too, and if she didn't leave the swamplands with the rebellion now, chances were good that she'd end up leaving them as a conscripted soldier in Ashamax's army soon enough. The other teens in the village might be content to plan extended trips out of town to hide from the enemy forces when they neared, but that felt too much like cowardice to Des, who desperately wanted to fight Ashamax's army, not hide from it. "Well done," said the recruiter. "I believe I have seen enough now to make my final decision for all 3 of you." Des glanced at him, wanting to sink into the ground in her shame at the tone of his voice, which was kind, but disappointed. It sounded like they were finished entirely now, like she wouldn't even get another match or 2 to try to redeem herself. Peter, who was still catching his breath after his brother's attack, carefully sheathed his sword. Con went back to twirling his, grinning with triumph. Des just stood there, unmoving, despair pulling her down, sure as a quicksand bog. "With his victory, Con has earned my automatic recommendation to join our ranks," the recruiter said. Con's grin widened, and he paused his sword twirling long enough to step forward and shake the man's hand. The recruiter gave him a crisp nod of approval. "You're 18, right? In another 2 years, you'll be old enough for a promotion to captain. I encourage you to aim for that." The recruiter then turned to the other 2 siblings. "However," he said, and Des's heart dropped into her shoes, "I don't think either of you 2 are ready to join yet. Peter, you need a bit more work. You're still slow and clumsy. And Desiree, you're too timid. In a real battle, hesitation will get you and the people relying on you killed." The words were gentle, but firm. Des was stepping forward and fumbling for words before she even registered her own actions. "Please," she said, "isn't there a way we could go with you now and prove our worth later? I promise we can do better. We will do better." But the man shook his head. "The rebellion can only feed and arm a limited number of soldiers. We can't afford to take on anyone who won't contribute more than they cost. Plus, he chuckled, I'm no high-ranking dragon. I can't bring back 2 scrubs on nothing but the weight of my own opinion, and have the rebellion brass take my word unquestioningly that they'll eventually prove their worth. Des winced at the mention of dragons. Her parents had been dragon riders, among the best and bravest of their kind. This man's words were just another reminder of how she was failing them. The recruiter turned to speak to Khan, his tattered chocolate-brown uniform rustling with the motion. I'll be in Bleakwater tonight and tomorrow, and then I'll be spending the next month or so in the neighboring villages. You'll have that time to pack up and say your farewells before we all move out to headquarters. Khan's grin faded, and his forehead creased as he glanced at Peter and Des. But eventually, he nodded. Yes, sir. The recruiter clapped him on the shoulder. Well done. He praised Khan, and then he strode out of the clearing and back toward the village, stepping carefully around the puddles that dotted the area. Desi's eyes burned. Emotions tangled through her like the interwoven roots of the cypress trees at her back. She couldn't tell which feeling was the strongest: shame, frustration, or worry. She breathed deeply again, trying to let the earthy smells ground her as they had before. But it didn't work this time. Khan broke the silence. Don't give up. The captain said he'll be in Bleakwater for another day yet. The both of you could ask for another go at it before he leaves. Another chance to show your skill in a match. Peter frowned at his big brother. What good would that do? Khan shrugged easily. It was just nerves. If you spar in front of him a second time, you won't have nearly so much stage fright. Peter glanced at Des. His gaze was tight, but resigned. Khan didn't understand, but Des did. Peter had already been trying his best, had fought as well today as he ever had, but he just wasn't good enough yet. And Des? She couldn't keep herself from holding back her full strength, no matter how many times she sparred. She was always too afraid to hurt someone. If they asked the recruiter to watch another match, it wouldn't change a thing. Maybe, Des answered half-heartedly. Khan slung an arm around each of his siblings, his wooden sword hanging over Des's shoulder. Come on, he said, good-naturedly jostling them both. How about we go charm Mrs. Adley into giving us some pastries? We can celebrate my victory. And our losses, Peter muttered. And your impending victories, Khan corrected him. There was a big part of Des that wanted to stay under the protective arm of her big brother, to let him cheer her up, to let his unswayable belief in her give her hope. But she couldn't shake the knowledge that he was wrong. She couldn't impress the recruiter. Not in a sparring match, anyway. But maybe the rebellion needed more than just warriors. Maybe she could find another way to impress the recruiter. Some valuable skill that would prove her worth, allowing her to be valuable to their army in a different way. She couldn't think of anything that might work right now, but she couldn't just give up. She had to at least try one more time. She owed her parents and herself that much. She shrugged off Khan's arm. Thanks, she said, but you two go ahead and get your pastries without me. I want to be alone for a bit. I have some thinking to do.